So I've got an issue that occurs every year. I'm up at my little mountain cabin outside of Asheville, and we're waiting for the harvest of my apples from my apple tree, and then like clockwork every year about the same time, this little guy comes and eats all my apples that have just ripened. How does he know to do it? And furthermore, why does he eat all my apples? They all ripen at the same time. So in this video, I'm going to get to the bottom of why the apples on my apple tree all seem to ripen at about the same time, and then this bear comes and eats all my apples and leaves me with nothing. Let's get started. In this video, I want to talk to you about positive and negative feedback loops in plants and animals. So what is a feedback loop? What is a feedback mechanism? Basically, in living organisms like plants and animals, they need to maintain some sort of homeostasis, right? So feedback mechanisms are a way that the organism can get some feedback on what's going on in itself and then respond to a change if it is needed. So feedback mechanisms help us maintain homeostasis and respond to change. So we want to talk in this video about two different loops. So I'm going to talk first about positive feedback loops, and then we'll talk about negative feedback loops. So let me give you a quick example of a positive loop, and then a quick example of a negative loop, and then throughout the video I'll give you several more detailed examples. So an example of a positive feedback loop, just a basic example, might be a bunch of cattle. What would happen if all of a sudden some of the cattle started to run? Well, if a few cattle started to run, that's a positive feedback loop. The overall level of panic is going to go up a bit. The other cattle are going to look around. They'll probably start running. And as you can see, this cycle continues. More cattle running, panic goes up more, which means more cattle will start to run, which means more cattle will be panicked. This is a positive loop because when something responds, when there's a stimulus and a response, that response just keeps going and amplifying itself over and over. That's a positive loop. A negative loop, think of your thermostat, right? You got it set to a perfect temperature. Let's say that perfect temperature is 70. I like it a little cooler, but let's say it's 70 degrees. So you've got a perfect temperature set. Well, what happens if the temperature goes up? It's too hot. Well, you know what happens. The air conditioner kicks in and lowers back to the perfect temperature. So in other words, when the temperature went in one direction, a negative loop will take it in the opposite direction. So it's negative from the way it went to begin with. Notice here in the positive loop, once we went one way, it just continued going in the same direction. A negative loop is the opposite. If something goes up, like the temperature, then the negative effect of that would be that the temperature then needs to go down. So think about your thermostat again. What if the temperature goes down and gets too cold? Well, then your heater's going to kick in and take it back to that perfect temperature. So these are the two loops. This is some basic examples of a positive and a negative loop. And in this video, I'm going to go over several positive and several negative loops that we find in both plants and animals. So we're going to start with negative feedback. A good example of negative feedback is listed below. And that is, we generally have a range for homeostasis. This could be blood glucose levels. It could be temperature regulation. There's a range that we like. Well, if there is a change, meaning the temperature goes too high, something has to sense that, send a signal to something that can control it, and then we need to get an output or an effector to return us back to our normal range. So this is maybe sort of a general scheme, if you will, of how a negative feedback mechanism works. Remember, the idea in living things is that negative feedback mechanisms maintain homeostasis by regulating the processes in the body to get the condition that's changed back to its target point. So if the temperature goes up in your body needs to sense that, send out something, make your body do something to return it back. We know that if the temperature goes too high, we start to sweat and our blood vessels change. We'll go over that in more detail. But this is a general scheme example of how a negative feedback mechanism works. So speaking of thermoregulation, this is how your body regulates temperature. This is a negative feedback loop. So we got our body temperature. Now, before this year, most people thought 98.6 was the average body temperature. We actually find that it's actually going down quite a bit. It's closer to like 97.3 now. So let's say your body temperature spikes. It goes up a bit. Well, what happens? We don't go and sit inside a freezer then, right? We're not lizards. What our body does for us is it maintains those levels naturally. So if your body temperature goes up, the brain, specifically the hypothalamus, records, gets that information, gathers the data, and says, oh no, temperature's too high. So it sends nerve signals, right, through the neurons, down the nerves, and two things then start to happen. One, you're going to start to sweat. Remember this idea of evaporative cooling. As the water leaves, it takes some of the heat with you. But also, right, there we are sweating. The other thing that's going to happen is that the blood vessels in our skin dilate, meaning they open up, they get a little thicker. There's a little more area or volume in them. Now, what is dilation in our blood vessels? How does that cool us down? Well, if you think about it, in the core of your body, right, there's a lot of heat. But if you're getting too hot, we want some of that heat to go to the extremities, where there's a lot of surface area. So that dilation in the skin blood vessel, it actually lets the heat sort of dissipate, and because there's a lot of surface area out here in the hands and the skin, the heat will leave because those blood vessels have opened up, allowing the blood to flow more freely. That helps to cool down our internal core temperature. So this is a negative loop because if the temperature goes too high, then it needs to come back down. It needs to do the negative or the opposite. Well, what happens if temperature goes too low? Same sort of thing. Brain hypothalamus has to sense that, has to send a signal through the nerves, and we shiver. What does shivering do, right? Start to use some of those muscles. We're going to burn some ATP, or we're going to make some ATP, burn some food, burn some calories, and shiver. Then the opposite is going to happen with the blood vessels here. The blood vessels will constrict, meaning, see how these are much smaller. That says blood vessels, blood don't go out to the small extremities in the skin. Instead, stay in the core. We need to maintain the core temperature of the body, which is why when you get really cold, often your skin and your fingers and your extremities actually get cold first, because you're trying to maintain that cold, that warm body temperature in the core. Okay, so thermoregulation, an example of a negative feedback loop. Another really common example is blood sugar. This is a big problem. Blood sugar getting out of control, right? So blood sugar is basically the amount of glucose, which is the sugar, right, in your bloodstream. We need sugar in our blood because glucose, as you know, is what is responsible for ATP production. It is the carbohydrate that is used to make ATP. So we need glucose to be circulating in our blood, but we actually need it at about a certain level. 70 to 110 is about the average level that we need for that glucose to be in our body. If it gets too high, we've got some problems. If it gets too low, we've got some problems. So your body maintains a pretty narrow range there of glucose. So let's say your blood sugar gets too high. Yeah, you've just ate a plate of cupcakes. Maybe you shouldn't have done all that, and you got all that glucose now in your body. So your blood glucose level is going to rise. Well, what happens is, once the blood glucose levels rise, the pancreas has these cells in it called beta cells. They secrete the hormone insulin. This hormone insulin then tells different cells, especially these in the liver, to take some of that glucose out of the bloodstream, right? So to take this glucose out of the bloodstream, store it in the liver as this glycogen, which is a more dense polysaccharide. So the insulin, in a way, was the hormone signal to take the glucose out of the bloodstream and store it as glycogen. That means then, because we've taken the glucose out of the bloodstream, that the blood glucose levels in the bloodstream will fall. Okay? So insulin was the hormone that takes glucose and converts it to glycogen. Now, conversely, what happens if the glucose level goes low? Let's say that you, for some reason, were fasting or you weren't eating. I don't advise this, but let's say you did it. Your blood sugar level falls really low. Well, in this case, some different cells in the pancreas, the alpha cells. The alpha cells in the pancreas will secrete glucagon, which is another hormone, but this hormone does the opposite of insulin. Insulin says glucose stores glycogen. The hormone glucagon says glycogen, break back down to glucose. We need to put some glucose back in the bloodstream, the blood supply. So glucagon breaks down, or is the signal for glycogen to be broken down back into glucose. Everything returns back to the levels or the range that they need to be. So when these levels rise back up, we have returned. So those were two examples of negative feedback loops. Once the level went in one direction, the negative loop kicked in and sent it in the opposite direction. All right, so now let's look at some positive feedback loops. So a positive feedback mechanism is really meant to amplify our response in a process. So the variable initiating the response is moved further and further away from the set point. What does this mean? So positive feedback means some stimulus A causes something to occur, B, which then causes more to occur back to A, which then the cycle continues. Think of our cattle. Once the cattle start running, right, then there's a lot of panic, more cattle will run, etc. So let me give you a very specific example. There are a few that we could talk about. In this example, I'm going to talk about fruit ripening. This is back to the beginning with my bear eating my apples on the apple tree. Why, generally, on an apple tree do all of the fruit ripen at about the same time? Well, that's because once one starts to ripen, it gives the signal for the rest to go ahead and ripen and break down those rigid cell walls, convert those polysaccharides to some sugar so that they taste better. So how does this start? Well, one apple that you might have, ethylene, a hormone, is released, and that stimulates the ripening in one apple. So it starts to ripen, develops into that delicious sweet apple that we like to eat. Well, once this has started, what happens is, because that ethylene was released, it starts to stimulate these others that are close to it. So the ethylene gas, this hormone, is detected by these apples that are closer by. Well, what do you think is going to happen there? Well, those nearby apples, because they have now sensed the ethylene, will release their own ethylene and start to ripen as well. And then because this is a positive feedback loop, more and more apples will continue to ripen. They will get that ethylene gas, and the cycle, this positive feedback, just continues on and on until, of course, all of the apples have ripened. So remember, positive, once it starts going in one direction, it's going to go all the way until it's finished. So it gets farther and farther away from its initial point, in this case, the initial point of not being ripe, to actually being very ripe. So another example that's very common to think about of a positive loop is the onset of labor in childbirth. So here we have a pregnant woman. Looks like this baby's pretty big, growing in the uterus here. Oh, it is about ready to come out. When the baby is ready to come out, what happens, as you can see here, the head of the fetus will start to put some pressure on the cervix, this opening to the uterus. When that happens, it sends a signal through the nerves to the brain. of the mother. And the mother, once her brain receives it, the pituitary gland in the brain secretes the hormone oxytocin, a very important, powerful hormone. Well, that hormone then travels down the blood back to the uterus and says, uterus, uterine walls compress, start to compress in, starts to contract. So what happens is the oxytocin is now causing this uterine wall to compress, to contract, to really push the baby forward even more. Well, guess what happens? When these walls contract and start to push in on the baby, that means the baby head is going to press even more on the cervix. And well, you guessed it, then the spiral continues. This is an important loop. It's an important loop that, and in fact, it's important that it's positive in this case, because once the baby starts to come out, we need it to finish, right? We don't want a baby halfway out. We don't want a baby just a little quarter. Once the baby starts to come, we need the baby to come on out. So it's important that this is a positive loop, and once the contractions start, we need the baby to come all the way out. And so this is a positive loop based on oxytocin. Oxytocin is a really interesting chemical. Not only is it the chemical here that we see that helps to contract the uterine walls, it's also what many consider to be the love hormone. So it's interesting to think about that the love hormone is what introduces your baby to you. So even though these loops have been pretty well preserved and selected for through evolution, occasionally loops can go bad in the body. So when there is an alteration in these feedback loops, we can have deleterious consequences, right? Bad, it can be bad news. And one example I want to give you is what happens to this blood sugar loop if it goes bad. And you've probably heard of diabetes. Diabetes type 2 is a particular example that I want to use today because we can see a loop, a blood glucose sugar loop that's really gone bad. So how does this all work? What I've got here for you is a typical like fat or muscle cell. This could also be in the liver. And what happens is, you may remember, when there's too much blood sugar, right? So when our blood sugar is high, blood glucose is high, remember that secretes insulin. Remember the pancreas secretes that insulin. Well, then where's the insulin go? This is sort of where we left off in our last example. The insulin travels here to the cell and binds to these receptors on the surface. Well, then what happens is that starts a signal cascade in the cell, and it then activates something called exocytosis, where a little bit of this membrane with these GLUT4 receptors will move up to this membrane and be now on the surface. Well, what's interesting about these receptors? Well, these are actually the receptors that take in glucose. All right, so to go over this one more time. When your blood sugar goes up, the pancreas releases insulin. Insulin comes to these receptors and binds. It goes in and says, hey, bring some of these receptors, these GLUT4 receptors, up to the surface so that they can take in the glucose and store it and take it out of the bloodstream. Okay, if you do not have diabetes, this works pretty well. If you do have diabetes, what happens is something called insulin resistance, meaning that over time, the insulin binding to the receptors over and over and over again, your cells become a little resistant to that insulin. And so that leads to a defect in the signaling here to get this GLUT4. So even though the insulin might be binding, there's a defect right here so that these GLUT4 receptors don't go up here and take in the glucose. So when the loops go bad, we can have some serious consequences, like you see here with diabetes type 2, which is one of the leading indicators of heart disease, stroke, or of death, and along with those other things, heart disease and stroke, in America, diabetes is a real big problem. So hopefully in this video you learned about the difference between positive and negative feedback loops, and you also learned about some problems when loops go bad and some of the debilitating issues that can arise. So I probably need to get back and get up to the cabin to make sure the bear is not eating any more of my apples. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, like and subscribe.